Nabucco created an explosion, really, in the middle of the 19th century. And it was something that literally kind of obliterated everything else on the musical map. Over the past few years, we've done a few pieces, Maria Padilla by Donizetti and Orazio Curiazzi and Mercadante. They were all created the same year. And those pieces kind of went off the map because of the power of Nabucco. Nabucco was a whole new sound. It was an exciting, kind of raw, masculine sound, and Verdi became really the great composer. He, along with Wagner, really rethought the whole idea of what opera could be in the middle of the 19th century. So it's a real pleasure to welcome the singers for Nabucco, starting with Nabucco, Jason Howard returning. Unlike Salome, he gets to wear clothes in this piece. And we do have that special fireman's outfit for him that we'll have in the third act. So underneath the robes, right. And it's a great pleasure to welcome back, I think, for her 13th or 14th role here at Minnesota Opera. I'm not sure what it is. Probably one of the very few women in the world that can actually sing Abigail, Brenda Harris. And I have to say, it's a real pleasure to welcome John Rayet to Minnesota Opera. He's truly one of the great basses in the world, and to have this kind of singer involved with this project is a real honor and a real pleasure. So welcome, John Rayet. Of course, this is the first year of music director Michael Christie's association with Minnesota Opera. And if those of you have a recent copy of Opera News, he's on the cover of it as who's who in the next generation of opera creators. So welcome, Michael. And we have our creative team here as well. We have our choreographer, Heidi Spessert-Noble, sitting over there, returning. And the guy who really put all of this together, whose idea it was, and who really kind of created the big co-production with Washington Opera Company of Philadelphia and Minnesota Opera, Thaddeus Strasburger, who would like to take us through this concept of Nabucco, and he will be assisted by Joel Ivany. Thaddeus is actually in LA right now doing I Due Foscari, and so Joel is going to take the reins and put the show, and Thaddeus will be back in a little while, but it's a great pleasure to welcome Thaddeus to Minnesota Opera. Thaddeus?
Nice to be here. The Nabucco, like Dale said, it sort of changed the way we see the world, but I think it's always dangerous to look back on these pieces as though we're trying to figure out, like, but what happened? Like, why do we think Aida's better? Or something. We sort of kind of get, like, through this cloud of everything else that's happened between then and now and World War II and everything. I think this piece particularly, the way it came in Verdi's life and sort of what happened afterwards, he was only 28 when he wrote the piece in 1842, and so you think of this extraordinary talent, so young, and we almost didn't get it because his personal sort of biography story as to what was going on in his own personal life really sort of influenced the rest of his career, and Nabucco was this big turning point. So I think that we have to think of it as something sort of youthful and crazy and filled with really passionate, exciting, inspired music and huge miscalculations in dramaturgy and but the excitement therein is that we get to know Verdi, the sort of master creator, operas from later, very early on. It's kind of like when you meet somebody right away and you think, oh my God, this is love at first sight. That's the person I'm going to be with for the rest of my life. And then like 3 months later, you kind of sort of see it all in light and day, and you sort of, oh, what have I gotten myself into? You know, doubt, what are we going to do? No, the wedding's off. And then like once you sort of get past that, then you think that actually everything that sort of has shown itself as being a flaw is actually the real humanity that makes that person or the opera, the creation, what it is. So I'm not disparaging at all when I say that it has big mistakes or big flaws or big problems in it, because I think that those things that's actually ridiculous to label them in such a fashion. It just makes it sort of so, has so much personality and makes the opera what it is. But in order to put it on stage, it takes a lot of work from the cast and the creative team to kind of make sense of it all, because where do I even start? Show me a picture. Maybe we'll... right, so it's a biblical story, obviously, that sort of vaguely based in some sort of historical fact, perhaps, but that's not really interesting to me. Whether it's sort of myth that helps us, you know, go about our everyday lives, or whether it's like, you know, we lived with the dinosaurs in 6000 BC or whatever. But the idea ultimately together is that we have these sort of ancient stories that we continue to tell and retell and to retranslate and mistranslate and use and abuse and use as propaganda, and then sort of go back to the heart of what they are, whether you're talking about Shakespeare or Aeschylus or the Bible or, you know, the Iliad or Dante or all of these classic stories. Is what is it telling us to... How is it speaking to us today? And I think you have to look at Verdi in the 1840s and what he was living through. So he was born in Busseto near Parma, which was not part of Milano at the time. So Italy we think of as a sort of country, very old country, you know, Roman ruins and everything. But really it wasn't formed until the 1860s, the same time as the Civil War in America. It was, you know, small city-states that had got bigger and bigger and bigger. Venice, the big one, that's the other opera I'm doing right now about how big Venice got and how much money it had. And, you know, Milano, which was quite big. Then you've got Florence, and then you've got Rome and the church and all of that stuff down south. But the idea that Verdi was a foreigner in Milano was really important. That when he showed up at Conservatory at the age of 17 and said, I want to sort of come here, and they said, well, no, you're not actually that talented, and we don't really taking that many foreigners right now. And he got a rejection letter from the Conservatory saying, well, thank you, but no. But he was actually going there to be a performance major and not a composer, and the story's not quite as sad as you think, that he was actually told, no, you'll never actually be able to play the keyboard well enough, because if you sort of played in a church when you were a kid and then at 17 decide to sort of take it professionally, then you won't be. But they're like, go back home and compose, and like, let's see what happens. Unfortunately, in the years after, he had a few minor successes at Scala with his early operas, some comedies. That unfortunately, his children died and his wife died, and at age 26, he was left without kids and without a wife, and he basically sort of wanted to throw it all in. He was living at home. He was going to play the organ at church and sort of take in private students. And he had gone to Milano, and Marelli, the impresario at the time at Scala, had said, no, come on, why don't you get back into this composing thing? We believe in you, and so everything you've done here hasn't been a huge success, but we believe in taking risks and being dangerous, and just trying to get things up, and we think that you'll have a chance of doing this. So he takes this Nabucco libretto, and he wasn't that inspired by it, and there's all sorts of apocryphal stories about, and then he read Va Pensiero, and he goes, I don't believe any of that. But what I do believe is that when you're at your worst, when you're at your lowest, if you're a musician, if you're a creator, if you're somebody that makes beautiful artwork, that you sort of go back to that core of who you are, and either, you jump off a bridge, or you create and you express your inner feelings on the outside, so everybody can criticize them on the blogs. It's never happened. It's all good. So what I think we get is actually something that's very raw, very fast. He composed it quite quickly. Unfortunately, we don't have as much correspondence about the early works as we do on the later stuff, because they weren't saving, backing up all the emails and stuff, because he wasn't famous enough yet to sort of think that, this correspondence is going to be very important in italics yet. But we do know that he composed it very quickly, and he went back to the theater and he said, all right, I've done it. I've gotten the commission. Let's pay. Let's get it on. And they're like, oh no, well, we've got big problems because we're having budget problems. We've had to cut back from 5 productions to 4 this year. And it's like all that stuff. And they're like, we're all booked up, and the workshops are very busy. It's like, all the same stuff. And he said, no, but you don't understand. I've got the right cast, which I think we heard about 5 minutes ago from Dale, and the time is right for this piece. We've got to make it happen. And the impresario said, well, I just don't have the money for a new production, but we did do a ballet in 1838, just 4 years ago, that's kind of on the same thing. It's the same theme. It's set in Babylon. I think we've got some Jewish costumes in the basement. Have at it. And literally, he said, that's fantastic, let's get it on, because what I need is the immediacy and the now and the excitement of it. And we don't need a bunch of workshops and run-outs and community development projects. We just need to put this thing on and not worry about our grant funding. Which, I sort of say it in jest, but I think that there's something the corporatization of art and everything, that we have to be really careful about, just sort of making sure that the spirit of the people that are on stage and the people making it happen in the pit that they're sort of unfiltered what ends up being on stage. So in order to sort of all this excitement that I feel about the piece, and the more I sort of thought about sort of what is its relevance, and I thought, well, it's not just the biblical story itself, but it's the sort of the underpinnings of the creation of the piece. And since it's a company premiere for all 3 companies that are part of the co-production, which is actually kind of shocking to me, that a piece that sort of to me towers above and would be maybe a desert island opera, hearing it for the first time. So why don't we sort of celebrate its kind of world premiere-ness in the production? And not sort of be encumbered by all of its history, but to celebrate it. So, and then sort of my own personal sort of background and what you bring to it is my background. I started out as a designer, and then I moved into directing. And sort of a fundamental part of my training was as a young artist in the Accademia La Scala, where it's a young artist program that has singers and directors and designers. And I was a designer in that team for a year, and then I stayed on and worked for the theater as an assistant after that. And the one thing that for me as an American, I'm from Tulsa, Oklahoma, I went to school in New York to start with, but sort of immersing myself in the sort of the Scala way of thinking is that, it's not a new art form, it's something that sort of has this sort of unbroken history. So if you're, a singer, you're always sort of dealing with the coaches who study with the coach, who study with the coach, who wrote the original cadenzas for the blah, blah, blah. And it all sort of goes back, and it sort of becomes alive as it goes along. But the same thing with the scene painting and the sort of the whole arte scenica, everything that ends up on stage is, sort of learned and inherited. And so the people that I was learning to paint under had painted under Nicolas Benoit, who was the famous one from the 50s and 60s, who had then studied under. I could give you the whole this begat, that begat, and it'll sound like Deuteronomy. But it literally goes back to the scene painting tradition that's been in place since the Bibienes and the beginning of the 17th century. And this sort of handing down and the sort of the arts and craftsmanship of what happens backstage, sort of influencing the aesthetic of what happens on stage. And if you start thinking about the political ramifications of the piece, where you sort of have these sort of various teams that are sort of opposing each other. You've got the Hebrews and the Babylonians, but we also sort of have the Republicans and the Democrats, or we've got, sort of the people that create things, or you have the people that consume things, or you have the 1% that screw you around, and you've got the rest of them that buy the stuff. But, you sort of have all, it just sort of seems like somehow we've got to sort of keep that sort of friction in play, and that it doesn't become something sort of old-fashioned, remote, and distant. Except I love the aesthetic of old-fashioned, remote, and distant. So what can you say? Originally the piece was called Nabucodonosor, which is the biblical translation of what was common, and nobody could say it, and so they just thought, let's call it Nabucco. But the sort of the style, I just sort of wanted to start thinking about sort of the whole production as though it were new in Verdi's time, but as I said, it wasn't new, because they were reusing sets that already existed and, sort of cobbling things together. So let me just get started to show you what it's going to look like. Enough talk. So, oh no, there's more to talk about. So you think about like the period of time that we're in. So we've got the 1815. The Austrians had started to occupy Milano, and it was sort of like all done diplomatically. That Austria not so far away. They were trying to get their empire bigger and bigger and bigger, and they had just sort of come in and said, "Hey, we're here." Obviously they spoke German. There was a lot of tension between the crowds. So by the time 1815 to 1842, the tension is really building up. And even then you get to like 1848, you have the 5 days of Milano, where there was 5 days of battling where the Milanese tried to kick out the Austrians, but it didn't work. It took another 18 years after that. But I mean, the Austrians were like really horrible. One little anecdote that I've read that's great is Radetzky, the main general that was sort of the occupier of Milano, had put huge tariffs on tobacco so that cigarettes had gotten really, really expensive, and you couldn't use local tobacco, but you had to import it through the Austrians and pay them taxes for it. And so the Milanese decided to stop smoking. They were going to do a boycott against smoking, and they're like, all right, we have to pay those stupid taxes, then we just won't do it at all. And Radetzky gave an order that all the Austrian soldiers should smoke as much as possible in the streets, like nonstop, and like blow it in the Italians' faces, just literally to say, you want to boycott, but we love smoking, it's great. So I mean, imagine Italians without cigarettes after like a week. Bad news, right? So it was all sort of ready to burst. And so this idea of an occupying that sort of takes people into some sort of emotional economic slavery isn't so far-fetched from what was going on at the time. And even you start looking at sort of the visual representation of these stories. You've got a painting here by Hayez, which is the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. And then you have contemporary painters that are painting what's happening in the streets of Milano. Literally, that's just up the street from Scala there. Like a 5-minute walk is where this is depicted, and you have almost the sort of same sort of epic mythological style of representing these events, and so you start to see the synthesis between then and now. Yeah. Next. Right. So just sort of like a detail of the painting here, the Hayez painting. It's massive. It's almost like scene painting. It hangs in Venice at the Accademia. It's a huge painting. So these figures are like this big, and you can just sort of get really close to it. And this sort of started being an inspiration for sort of the costume style and the movement style and what's going on. So next. Right, but then so you sort of see the idea of, what's being painted ancient is sort of what's being depicted. This is actually from a newspaper, like a lithograph that was reproduced of like what happened yesterday. But the theater itself, Scala's interior has changed. It was bombed really badly during World War II. Actually, kind of after the fact, there wasn't a good military reason for it, but it's the British bombed it just to sort of say, "Ha, we got you." And it's to think that an opera house is the center of cultural life, and that's something that you would damage to sort of get people. Still speaks to the power that the opera house has today. The interior was drastically redesigned when they rebuilt it after the war, but this is what it looked like at the period of Verdi. And they had these show curtains that were painted for every season because everything was gaslight, so a lot of the curtain that was there all the time got damaged with all the smoke and the soot, and they burned up sometimes. So they replaced it every year, and they would sort of commission an artist to paint this sort of apotheosis painting, to celebrating usually themes of like music and art and mythology and all of that. This is just sort of a foretaste of what's coming, and we all know what the theater looks like outside. The facade actually hasn't changed that much. There's photographs of Verdi outside that, but the top of it here, this frieze, which isn't original to the theater in 1776, came a little bit later, depicts Apollo sort of rising the sun, and then you can see the goddess of night there chasing. So these little details that maybe you don't think about when you go see the opera house all the time, but you sort of think about the cycle in Zachariah's text that he has in the third act. It's sort of come notte sol fuggente, right? So as the sun will rise, no, that's actually the first act. As the night will rise, then the sun will rise. We sort of keep everything going. But this idea, this sort of cyclical nature, sort of speaks to the universality of the piece. So I sort of took that as the sort of symbol of Scala that anybody would recognize from the outside, and then started incorporating that into the set. So this is actually the show curtain for the drop. So that sort of apotheosis painting I was telling you about, sort of taking in these elements of Scala and putting them together. So that's an actual Yeah, so then that's how it all sort of starts to look together. So the opera, it's kind of like an opera within an opera within an opera. It's kind of Russian doll sort of style here as we sort of go further on. But we're in 1840s, we're in La Scala. I'm not sort of setting it really specifically like on this day, you know, on the eve of the revolution or something. It just sort of is within that sort of framework. It's kind of like a mythological mid-1840s kind of world in which this stuff could happen. So this is basically what the set looks like. And then just talking about the scene painting, this sort of tradition I talked about, the painter that I worked with is Paolino Liberato, who's not only a good friend, but a really close artistic collaborator in many ways, painting this scenery. Sort of like one man with two assistants that just sort of goes at it and takes my ideas and all the renderings and just sort of blows them up. So we sort of this real sort of old school craftsmanship. Next. Right. So there's the painting of the horses. So you're starting to get an idea of this sort of like tactile quality of what we've got. We see so much that's like sort of CGI'd and sort of artificial and sort of out there. It's just sort of nice to like smell something. You know, it's totally old school. All the paints are like powder and it's just animal glue and you know, lots of thought and creativity. So then when you start putting the whole thing together, as I said, setting in the 1840s, that the Milanese still frequented the theater, but then there were also the Austrians that came to the theater as well. And so you had this sort of uneasy mix. And so we start during the overture. There's actually sort of this entrance of the audience, and you know, it looks, you can see that people are there for a big event socially, but maybe perhaps not to be moved by the piece. That doesn't happen at all today in opera houses, by the way. That's something that's historical. And you've got the guards, the Austrian soldiers as well as a sort of keeper of order because, you know, the opera house was the place when anything could happen. Next. What else is here? Right, so I mean, this is a clip from the movie Senso by Visconti, which is a little bit later in the Fenice, but it's still, that was right before the revolution in the 1863, I think it said 1864. But you get a sense, these Austrian soldiers, if you look at the posters from the premiere and even the few years after that, there's like ticket prices for Milanese, and then there's like subscriptions and all these things. But if you're a soldier and you turn up in uniform, then you get a ticket that was like 1/10 of the price. And the idea was to get as many soldiers there as possible so that they could sort of keep the order, and also, you know, sort of this intimidation factor that, like, you know, it's not really your theater anymore. You've got a bunch of foreigners there. So this is kind of the idea for the costumes of the patrons that arrive. And then when we actually get into the real scenery, I use a real old-fashioned kind of painted sets, but it allows us to have these big, expansive places. And it also really affects the acting style as well, because, you know, they're not really columns. They're just bits of muslin that are painted. So you can't lean on them. You can't run into them. You can't. So you end up sort of being kind of distanced from it. And but from a vocal point of view, I think the way the opera is written, by keeping everything downstage and away from the perspective of it, we get sort of the right visual mix and the right sort of sonic mix. And, you know, there's something about the craftsmanship of the time period that is kind of intrinsically written into the piece as well. So it's kind of a win-win. We like those. And then just sort of going through, so there's this big Temple of Solomon, you know, which nobody knows what it really looks like, you know, how many cubits high was the thing, but it's sort of this fantasy. And the other thing, too, is that I didn't want to get too much into sort of like the Judaica of the whole situation, because if you think in the 1840s, there's very little information that, you know, 150% Catholic country had about what was happening in the Middle East. And even the things that we've since excavated, a lot of those excavations in Iraq and the sort of the Babylonian era didn't even take place until like the 1920s. So they had an idea that was kind of like a mixture of Egyptian meets Greek. And they thought, well, if you kind of like put those in a test tube, which they also didn't have, and shook it up, then you would get something that would be Babylon. And I tried to put in kind of these anachronistic decorative details that are just plain wrong as well, but it sort of gives a sense of the again, that sort of humanity and the sort of the brokenness I was talking about, which I think we find in the score and the libretto in places, you know, sort of visually not sort of like cover that up, but to kind of celebrate the heartfelt directness of it all. Yeah. And then production photos, you can see lots of costumes. Lots of people running around. It has a very footlight sort of feeling aesthetic to it. You can see down front that there's these gas footlights that sort of inform the aesthetic as well. Next. Oh, then we take an intermission. Take 2 intermissions in the piece. It's great. I'd love to take 7 intermissions. Opera's really long, but you know. Then we come back and we're in the for Abigail. You know, sort of this is you know a place in the palace, and you know sort of very Mediterranean style where you've got sort of inside, outside, sort of these open spaces. But it's, you know, again, just this sort of all flat painted scenery with beautiful skies. And you can see the boxes there. The patrons are always there, sort of watching on as well. And that's an actual 3-dimensional thing. And then the scenery can go away to these more abstract bits. Next. Then Zachariah's aria, for example, the first one, you know, again, playing with the whole idea of like these sort of in-one scenes. We don't sort of stop for big scene changes, but it sort of keeps flowing. So these sort of intimate sort of ideas. So there's Daniel in the lion's den sort of playing with the biblical vocabulary a bit, that he's sort of feeling menaced by the infidels there, and he's putting himself right. So you can see that sort of going on. And then it opens up then to another big set, which now we're in Babylon with this big sundial, and so on and so forth. It goes, there you go. Next. Then we take another intermission. And then we come back. There you can see the Hanging Gardens set. This is like the same columns, but you just see more of it, and there's these palm trees in the background. It's very lush, and it's also very, Technicolor is the wrong word, it's the wrong period, but it's a lot brighter. We sort of spend a lot of time looking at the 19th century sort of through sepia-toned glasses, just because that, again, the technology, there's lithographs from newspapers. It's all black and white, but actually they were very, very colorful. I spent a lot of time in the archives at Scala looking at original paint samples and fabric samples and everything, because a lot of these costumes still exist, and they're really, really, really bright, because you also think about the lighting being these sort of low, dim, yellowy gaslight, that you really had to push the colors in order to get something that didn't look like black and white. So we've sort of like tweaked that up as well, so it doesn't look like you might have imagined. The colors are really, really intense. And then just an idea of the props. You know, we're sort of in that world there. I love anything you can touch. Yeah. And then you can start seeing it with all the people and the things coming together, Abigail coming in. And then for the Va Pensiero, you know, it's like, what do we do for the Va Pensiero? It's this whole, you know, big mythological thing. First of all, it sounds different than what the text is, which I think is really exciting. I mean, it has this kind of sense of being sort of lugubrious and slow, but you know, by the time you come on, you know, it's all sort of like death and destruction again. And, you know, it's loosely based on Psalm 137, you know, like, oh, we'll sit by the banks of the river and weep, and we hang up our harps because we won't make music. And you start thinking, again, this whole idea about what it means to create culture, because they say that by playing the harp and singing our songs, then we're actually giving up some of who we are, and we're sharing the beauty of who we are, and they're actually refusing to have a dialogue with the Babylonians in that, because the Babylonians are like, hey, you know, why don't you whistle while you work, because, you know, I love that klezmer music. And they're thinking, no, we're going to like lay back, and we'll actually so the idea of music being powerful enough as a political tool, that by withholding it and withholding joy and passion and excitement and, you know, sort of a window into your soul. I think that's something really good to stop and remember when we're in this business, when sometimes it just seems like agents and contracts and blogs. And what it really means to be is, you know, like who we are as people, really, really exposed out there. We love the blogs, though, I think, yeah. But what's interesting about the Psalm 137, it's like, oh, it's Psalms, like that's the happy part of the Bible. It's not, you know, like so death and destruction. But it's like you get to Psalm 137:9, and it's like, blessed be he who takes the Babylonian babies and dashes their heads against the rocks. You know, which is basically the subtext for your whole aria. So it's not, you know, woe is us, and, you know, we'll forbear as long as possible. It's, no, we will fight back, and, you know, our scorpion tail will strike harder and faster. Just you watch. And by the way, we'll sing death to the foreigners about 5,000 times. So what was my point on that? What's the picture we have for this? Right, so the idea, what's coming next, Alex? Yeah, so this idea that then the sort of culture that was surrounding the piece, all the people that are creating it. There's Italians putting on opera that sort of became this, sort of weird corporate entertainment for the Austrians that didn't speak Italian, didn't know what was going on stage. But yet, I think sort of through this emotional power of music that transcends the words, the libretto, the story, the situation, he was able to sort of get the whole Italian community kind of riled up in a way that was like the sort of preceded idea of expelling the Austrians. So the way we're handling the piece is you sort of have this, we start to set up the scene as though we were in the same 1840s vocabulary, and there's this beautiful sky script behind it and everything, but then very quickly after that, the scrim bleeds through, and you start to see that what you see on stage is just the tip of the iceberg of what creates a production, and this room is filled with a lot more people than we have soloists on the page. All of these people, you start to bleed through the scrim, and you see the sort of the backstage team of everybody who's there, and all of these people that are moving the scenery around, and chorus and other scenes, and supers and dancers. You start to sort of see them as this sort of apotheosis cloud sort of floating above the plight of the Hebrews that are on stage, and you realize the plight of the Italians is sort of part and parcel, and it's literally just sort of superimposed on top of that. So we had this sort of poetry moment where we sort of get a glimpse behind the curtain. And then when we get into the last scene, biblically, Nabucco really went mad. He had some sort of mental disease. Most, I guess, rich, powerful, religious people kind of go crazy. In the Bible, however, he had a moment of, 7 years later, it seemed to have magically cured itself. Maybe the drugs got approved. I don't know. But he was actually, it said that he was with the, crawling around in the fields with the animals, and he grew feathers and claws like an animal. I think it was probably just dreadlocks and no manicure for 7 years. But that he didn't spend any time with inside the palace. And so the way we've done it here, the way this production sort of works is it's kind of like enough with this whole sort of 18th century idea, and we sort of take it into something that maybe feels a bit more 21st century in our understanding of mental illness, power, and sort of how that corrupts itself. And we end up with Nabucco sort of literally in this cage, if you go to the next one. So we actually see him, sort of, in a cage like an animal, going crazy. And all of this stuff, when Abdallah comes back and the warriors are going to save him and everything, it's all this sort of fevered imagination of what's happened. Because unfortunately, even though we don't have a very good system for dealing with mental health in this country, oh, that was politics. Wait, no, it's opera. Hang on. We start to see that that Nabucco can't sort of magically heal himself by believing that if you do horrible things to all your life over and over and over, and that you don't have remorse for it, that you can't sort of magically say, I'm very sorry. And I think that that's kind of a good lesson that we can take away from this, sort of removed from the larger geopolitics of it. So we see him in a cage for a while with Abdallah in the background, and then it's when the statue of Baal explodes and everything, it's all part of this fevered imagination, and he's sort of going crazy, and all this stuff with Fenena coming back, and everybody at the end, it's like, oh, and you were there, has this kind of sort of ethereal quality to it, which I think is borne out by the musical structure as well. I mean, it's been a lot of recitals and ensembles and all of this, and then it just sort of it starts to build almost like the way Figaro does. It's lots of little bits, and then it sort of somehow just sort of envelops you in a way that you weren't even expecting at the end with this immenso Jehovah. And when the lady doth protest too much, when they're talking about the power of Jehovah and everything that can go on, you're kind of wondering, is it a question mark at the end of it, or is it an exclamation point? And I think that's the, one of the bigger issues that sort of gets addressed in the piece. As we know, Verdi himself, through his later work, was extremely anti-clerical and very suspect of the church and its role in governance and power. And when Verdi was involved in the formation of the original parliament in Torino in the 1860s, that he was very much into this idea of separation of church and state. And anytime he deals with religious powers, he doesn't really take sides, except to say, well, it looks like you people are destroying our lives. If you look at Aida, they're essentially Taliban kind of characters that are in this. You have the same thing in Otello. You have the same thing in Traviata, these sort of middle-class, vaguely religious values of Germont. he never sort of says, well, like, let's turn to God, and that really will be the answer. It's like we're seeing that power, money, and religion is a volatile mix. And even though in this piece, it's a very young piece for him at 28, he already had these ideas that were quite advanced and precocious for somebody of his age, and having lived in such a really tight agricultural community where religion played such a daily role, 3 times a day going to Mass. Whereas his house that I visited where he was born in Oroncole was literally like from here across the street to the church that he was baptized in, and he was born, and half an hour later he was in the church. So it was definitely part of the fiber of his cultural being, but intellectually, musically, creatively, I think that he was able to fly on golden wings away from where he had started. Yeah, there you go. At the end, next, something else. Right, and then at the end, this the other sort of thing that we have with this piece is the expectation or whatever. I hate that word, or tradition. It always sort of seems like the last crap way you saw it is sort of what becomes like tradition, as opposed to just sort of figuring out what the heart of the piece is. And I think the tradition should just be to do really good work every time you turn up in the rehearsal room and in the theater. That this idea of the Va Pensiero, which is such an amazing piece of music that moves people even when it's decontextualized from the piece, but to sort of wrap everything back around. The way that I did it in Washington, and the way I think that it can be successful again, is at the very end of the piece we sort of set up this conflict, and we know what's happening with the Austrians, the Babylonians, the Hebrews, the Italians. It's all sort of there. To reprise the piece, not in the context of the piece that kind of like stops it and it's kind of like, shuffle, repeat, but at the end we actually started doing applause, bows, and then when Abigail came out, who had really sort of been, she's kind of the villainess and heroine of the piece inside, but obviously very conflicted as to, whether she's a protagonist, antagonist to the whole thing, and what do we believe about her. But then we actually sort of discover at the end that, she's not some sort of Babylonian villain, but she's an Italian singer, the role originally created by Verdi's partner, lover at the time, Giuseppina Strepponi. We're sort of using the role of Abigail as a sort of stand-in for the personal voice that comes out. And we started the audience is going crazy, obviously, because it's a big successful evening out, and everybody's so happy that they, got dressed and got to the theater on time. And then they've sort of been immersed in this whole excitement of the event, and then out of nothing, I was able, Abigail, just literally, it's amazing with like just a simple gesture of how you can make 3,000 people absolutely as quiet as a pin drop. It's like a Sprint commercial from the 90s. It's like you can hear everything. And then we started singing the Va Pensiero again, just with a single voice, a cappella, nothing going on around it. And then as the curtain rose, we saw that the entire company was on stage, sort of in this sort of heartfelt protest, anthem singing event that felt very kind of, in a way, dangerous and spontaneous. And I think that those are two things that opera should always be. All we get is a score off the shelf, which is a bunch of lines and dots and words, and it's us that have to absolutely bring life to it in the meantime. And I think to sort of back away from the gospel of what a score can be and to figure out what the real spirit of it is something that I'm working very hard to celebrate in the whole production. But then by giving it this sort of added oomph extra at the end, what I'm hoping that we do is that the work that we do on stage doesn't sort of end with the sort of the curtain closing and that's it, and now we can go back to real life, but that it's this sort of Alice in Wonderland world that gets open to us, and that we can always sort of live in a world that is filled with metaphor and poetry, and that we don't get to sort of encapsulate the Opera House as something we do in a subscription series 5 times spread out over the course of 8 months, but it's something that constantly informs the way we interact with each other. And a mentor of mine once said, everybody talks about, opera being, bigger than life, and these emotions, and people like fall in love in 5 minutes, and it's so sort of unrealistic, and it's sort of steroids and pumped up. And he said, well, no, actually, I think that opera is like just kind of starts to get close to the immensity of what the human experience is. And if you think that Mimi and Rodolfo fall in love too fast, then you've probably never fallen in love, because it actually happens much faster than that. So I think that all of those things are sort of contained within this Nabucco. And as even Brenda and I were just talking this morning very briefly sort of about the weird ratchetiness of the piece, that we don't know if it's late bel canto, if it's early Verdi, but how can it be early Verdi before Verdi was Verdi? And it just sort of exists in this place that feels really on the edge. And you don't go to the circus to watch somebody sitting in a lazy boy in the middle of the ring. You go to watch people fly on trapezes and ride in motorcycles and cages and walk the tightrope. And I think that that's what this piece absolutely has to feel like, from the very first chord of the orchestra to the last tearful moment of the Va Pensiero reprise. Has to sort of feel that we're living on the edge, and that we're pulled out of something that is every day, and that we might as well just try to live in this world all of the time, because I think that we live in a place of heightened emotions and sensitivity. And as Joel and I will talk a lot throughout the rehearsal process, is that for the people on stage, that it's as much, if not more, about listening to what's happening around you than what it is about like producing sound. And it's like even just, I'll finish up here, is like photographers, when they come to the opera, the final dress, and you're always upset because like the wigs aren't right yet and all this, and that goes away. But it's like, I always say, I try to talk to photographers, and I say, take pictures of people when they're not singing, because when they're listening, they're acting with 150%. When you're singing, you're thinking about singing, you're thinking about words, you're thinking about a conductor, you're thinking about lots of things, and you're also giving out energy. And I think that what's equally, if not more exciting, is to watch people consume energy or receive energy. And this piece has a reputation maybe for sort of being balls to the wall, downstage, and produce. But it also, for the audience, we have to sort of remember, and also for those of us that are on stage, is this sort of dialogue and sympathy could go a long way towards, avoiding World War III or something. So we've got our work cut out for us, I think. It's a big piece. It's shorter than you think. It moves along at a clip. But there's lots of things to be done between now and then, and I can't wait to see it all come together.